Imagine you receive an invitation you cannot refuse. There is no signature on the envelope. There does not need to be. Everyone in the city knows whose cars those are, parked outside your building. Everyone knows what it means when men in long coats knock on your door after midnight and say, quietly, almost politely, "You have been invited to dinner." You do not ask where. You do not ask why. You do not call anyone, because calling anyone would put them in danger too. You simply look at your reflection one last time, step outside into the cold Moscow night, and climb into the back of a black car with curtained windows, moving silently through empty streets toward pine forests and armed gates and a table full of the most powerful and most dangerous men on earth. And you already know, somewhere deep in your bones, that whatever happens behind those walls tonight, you will never be allowed to speak of it. That is where our story begins. The Kuntsevo Dacha, officially known as the nearby Dacha or Blizhnaya Dacha, was far more than a simple country residence. Located just a few kilometers west of Moscow, hidden behind thick pine forests and layers of armed security, this property became the true beating heart of Soviet power during the Stalinist era. Built in the late 1930s, the dacha was deliberately designed to project an image of modest simplicity on the outside while functioning as a sophisticated center of political control on the inside. Stalin spent the majority of his later years living and working from this location, often conducting state business, signing documents of enormous consequence, and hosting the inner circle of Soviet leadership within its walls, rather than from the Kremlin itself. The building was equipped with multiple dining rooms, a cinema, private quarters, and extensive grounds, all surrounded by multiple perimeters of guards who answered to the secret police. What made Kuntsevo especially significant was the psychological atmosphere it created. Guests invited there understood that the invitation was not optional. Senior members of the Politburo, military commanders, and cultural figures were summoned to attend late-night dinners that frequently stretched until 4 or 5 in the morning. Leaving early was interpreted as a sign of weakness or suspicion. Falling asleep at the table was safer than excusing yourself politely. Every detail of behavior was watched, noted, and potentially used. The dacha was simultaneously a home, a court, a theater of loyalty, and a trap. It was here that some of the most consequential and most secretive moments of Soviet history unfolded, away from official records, away from witnesses who could speak freely, and away from any form of accountability that the outside world might impose. Lavrentiy Beria's reputation as a predator is not merely the product of anti-Soviet propaganda or post-collapse gossip. It is one of the most thoroughly documented aspects of his personal biography, confirmed by multiple credible historical sources, survivor testimonies, and even the admissions of his former colleagues after his arrest and execution in 1953. As the head of the NKVD and later the MGB, Beria commanded the most feared security apparatus in Soviet history. He had the power to arrest, torture, exile, or execute virtually anyone in the Soviet Union, and he used that power not only for political purposes but for deeply personal and criminal ones as well. His method was consistent and predatory. He would identify women across Moscow, sometimes having them followed, sometimes approaching them directly through intermediaries, and sometimes having them simply brought to his residence on Malaya Nikitskaya Street. Women who caught his attention had almost no means of refusal, because refusing Beria meant risking the safety of their entire families. After his arrest, investigators discovered extensive evidence of his crimes against women, and multiple victims came forward once the protection of his power was removed. Nikita Khrushchev, who knew Beria personally for decades, explicitly described him as a dangerous and degenerate figure whose behavior toward women was criminal. What makes Beria's case historically significant beyond its individual horror is what it reveals about the structure of Soviet power. A man of his documented character rose to become the second or third most powerful person in the largest country on earth. His crimes were known among the leadership. They were tolerated, ignored, and in some cases facilitated because he was useful, because he was feared, and because the system had no internal mechanism to hold men of his rank accountable for anything they chose to do. The role of women in Stalin's inner circle and in Soviet elite culture more broadly was deeply contradictory and profoundly revealing. On the surface, Soviet ideology proclaimed the liberation and equality of women as one of the revolution's proudest achievements. Women were celebrated in propaganda as workers, soldiers, mothers, and equals. But within the actual corridors of power, within the private spaces where the real decisions were made and the real culture of the elite was expressed, women occupied an entirely different and far more vulnerable position. They were decorative, they were useful, and they were disposable. Actresses and singers were particularly exposed because their professions required them to be visible, to perform publicly, and to cultivate relationships with powerful patrons who could advance or destroy their careers overnight. The entertainment world in the Soviet Union was not a space of artistic freedom. It was a space heavily controlled by the state and by the individuals who ran the state. A singer who performed at a Kremlin banquet did not simply arrive, sing, and leave. She entered a web of obligations, expectations, and dangers that the outside world could not see and that she could not easily escape. Wives of political figures faced a different but equally impossible situation. Their husbands' positions depended entirely on maintaining favor with those above them. A wife who attracted unwanted attention from a more powerful man was caught between the danger of compliance and the danger of refusal, knowing that either path could lead to catastrophe for herself and everyone she loved. This was not a culture of seduction or romance. It was a culture of absolute power, operating on human beings who had been systematically stripped of every protection and every means of resistance, all while the official ideology insisted loudly that they had never been more free. To understand what happened in the private spaces of Stalinist power, one must first understand the total and suffocating nature of the fear that governed Soviet life at every level during that period. This was not ordinary political caution or social discomfort. This was an existential terror that shaped every word spoken, every relationship maintained, and every decision made by millions of people across the Soviet Union for decades. The Great Terror of the late 1930s had demonstrated with absolute clarity that no one was safe, no position was secure, and no personal history of loyalty or service could protect an individual if those above them decided they were a threat or simply found them inconvenient. Entire families were destroyed. Children were separated from parents. Friends informed on friends, not always out of malice, but out of the desperate calculation that informing first was the only way to survive. Within this context, the silence that surrounded what happened at those private feasts was not simply a matter of discretion or personal shame. It was a survival mechanism that operated at the most fundamental level of human instinct. A woman who had been brought into those circles and experienced something she could not speak about, understood with complete clarity that speaking would accomplish nothing except her own destruction and the destruction of everyone connected to her. There were no institutions to appeal to. The courts, the police, the party, all of these structures answered to the very men whose behavior needed to be reported. Even after Stalin's death, the silence continued because the structures of power, though changed in form, continued to reward those who did not ask difficult questions and punish those who did. The culture of silence that surrounded the abuses of the Stalinist inner circle was therefore not a passive absence of courage. It was an active, rational, and tragic response to a system that had made truth-telling into a potentially fatal act. One of the most intellectually honest things that can be said about the private behavior of Stalin's inner circle is that the line between documented historical fact and amplified rumor is genuinely difficult to locate with precision. This difficulty is not accidental. It is the direct result of how totalitarian systems manage information both during their existence and after their collapse. During the Soviet period, the most sensitive details of elite behavior were simply never written down in any official form. The archives that do exist were carefully curated to present the leadership in ways that served the political needs of whoever was in power at any given moment. After the USSR collapsed in 1991, previously classified materials became partially available, but the opening of archives was uneven, incomplete, and complicated by decades of deliberate destruction of sensitive documents. What emerged from this environment was a mixture of genuinely revelatory historical evidence, credible personal testimony from survivors and witnesses, and a significant volume of sensationalized accounts that blended fact with speculation in ways that were difficult to separate. Serious historians who have studied this period, including Orlando Figes, Simon Sebag Montefiore, and Amy Knight, among others, have documented Beria's crimes extensively and described the general culture of the Stalinist court with considerable detail and credibility. But even they acknowledge the limits of what can be known with certainty about specific events in specific private settings. The sensationalist headlines that surround this topic in popular media frequently collapse this distinction entirely, presenting speculation as fact and rumor as revelation. This does not mean the underlying reality was innocent. The documented evidence is damning enough on its own, but intellectual responsibility requires acknowledging where certainty ends and where inference begins, particularly when the people most affected by these events were systematically prevented from leaving any testimony at all. Every discussion of the power dynamics within Stalin's inner circle, every examination of the behavior of men like Beria, and every analysis of what happened in those private spaces ultimately risks committing the same error that history has always committed with respect to these events, centering the powerful and leaving the powerless in the margins. The real story, the story that deserves the most careful attention and the most serious moral weight, is not the story of the men who held power. Their biographies are extensively documented. Their political decisions have been analyzed from every angle. Their psychology has been examined, debated, and theorized about in hundreds of books and thousands of academic papers. But the women who passed through those rooms, who were summoned, coerced, used, and then returned to a silence they had no choice but to maintain, remain almost entirely invisible in the historical record. We do not know most of their names. We do not know what happened to them afterward. We do not know how they carried what they experienced through the decades that followed, through marriages and children and ordinary daily lives built on top of experiences they could never speak about. Some of them almost certainly did not survive. Some of them may have found ways to process and endure. But history, in its tendency to follow power rather than vulnerability, never thought to ask. Recognizing this gap is not simply a matter of historical completeness, it is a moral obligation. Because if we examine this period only through the lens of political history, only through the decisions and rivalries and ambitions of powerful men, we are unconsciously reproducing the same erasure that the system itself performed on these women in real time.